There will be a half hour or so for questions and answers. So please be ready with your questions. Nom will be facilitating that portion of the webinar, and we'd appreciate as many questions in the chat function as possible, but also please feel free to put up your hand if that's what works best for you. And following the Q&A, of course, we'll just have a close and thanks to our hosts and to our guest presenter. Just the tiniest bit of housekeeping, please, everyone. Firstly, all our presenters have told us that they love seeing your faces. So if your home internet or your work internet does permit, please keep your camera on. But of course, please keep your mute on until you're asking a question. Another little bit of housekeeping. We've noticed today that across Australia, there's a little bit of problems with some internet, and that could be the case with our guest presenter, Faith Gordon. So if there is a little bit of discontinuity, we just ask for your patience. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Faith Gordon. Faith is a senior lecturer in law at the College of Law at the Australian National University, and she has special expertise in the areas of criminal justice and criminal law. Among her many research projects, she's collaborated with the London-based youth organisation Catch-22 in exploring the usage of social media among children and young people and the increasing harm caused by inappropriate online behaviour and content. And Faith is also a collaborator with the host today, and along with Dr. Nom Peleg, provide expert guidance to our hosts, DTP, Youth Law Australia, and Australian Lawyers for Human Rights in rolling out this webinar series. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Faith Gordon.
Thank you so much, Matthew, for the really warm welcome. And I am based in Canberra, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the lands on which this university stands. And I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty of these lands was never ceded, and it was and always will be Aboriginal land. So thank you so much to DTP for organising this webinar today and for the invite. And also, you know, in relation to me being part of DTP, it's one of the most exciting collaborations that I'm part of in Australia. So I really appreciate the invite today to present. So today's session, I've got 5 key aspects that I'd like to touch on today. A bit of an introduction, drawing on the children's report that UNICEF produced back in 2019 in the run-up to the UN Committee's examination of Australia. Then I'd like to make some reference to the COVID-19 pandemic, so the really unique times that we're going through at the moment, and the fact that, you know, for many children and young people, all aspects now of their lives by default have gone digital. Then I'd like to draw on the framework of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and in particular the 3 Ps conceptual framework. And I'd like to link that then to drawing out some themes from the various research studies that I have conducted in partnership with organisations. And then I'd like to make reference to the UN General Comment on Children's Rights and the Digital Environment, which was published in March of this year. And I'd like us to consider really this question about what outlined that actually young Australians are amongst the nation's most digitally included. And as of 2016, the vast majority of Australian families had Wi-Fi access at home, and around 86% of Australian teenagers are recorded as owning or using a mobile phone or a smartphone. However, as that report outlined, there do remain several barriers to digital inclusion, and that often includes, you know, the cost of data, but also the quality of the service of connectivity, which Matthew touched upon, we're having difficulties today in relation to. And this has been something that has really emerged in the research during COVID with education going online. And I'll talk a bit about that today. Also, in Australia, there is the very unique entity of the E-Safety Commissioner, which was established in 2015. And this has played a really key role, this office, in online safety efforts. And we know that thematically, that office deals with cyberbullying and reporting of image-based abuse. And there are a number of other aspects to that role, which has a legislative framework. And it's something that internationally is unique, and other countries often look to Australia in relation to that model. And the UNICEF report also outlined that, and argued really that if children are to be adequately prepared for the digital future, then it's going to be really critical that we all pay more attention and give more weight to their rights, particularly their participation and provision rights. So the COVID-19 pandemic context, UNICEF reported last year that 1.5 billion children and young people were affected by school closures worldwide. And this has meant that there has been increased time spent online on various different platforms. And a number of colleagues and I from the University of Melbourne, ANU, and LSE have written an article, which I'll give you the reference to later. And we've looked at children and young people's experiences, and particularly their privacy and right to play as well. And that research has really highlighted that all of this increased time spent online can leave children open to various harms. And specifically, we looked at exploitation and grooming. And international reports have shown all around the world really that there have been a lot of increased need for advice and reporting. And this is something that I've explored with colleagues, a comparative piece in the UK about children and young people's need for advice during the pandemic with regards to legal need in relation to issues that they've experienced, such as cyberbullying online. Now, I'm sure that many of you will have seen during the pandemic all of the media coverage and content in the focus. And there have been a number of really key reports that have been published here quite recently in Australia. Michael Salter recently published a report about child sexual exploitation, and that was supported by the Safety Commission. I'm going to draw on some research that I've conducted with children and young people, particularly from the most marginalised social groups, so children who have been involved in the criminal justice system and in the care system, and who are at risk or have been deemed at risk of being exploited. So the COVID-19 pandemic, some reports in Australia have really highlighted or quantified that all of this time spent online has gone up hugely. And children and young people that I've spoken to in interviews, some have been tracking just how much extra time they've been spending online. And for many children and young people, this has been a way to connect with people during the COVID pandemic, but also they acknowledge that it's left them more open to being approached by people they don't know, or having more access to also unwanted content. And many older siblings have talked about the need to provide more monitoring for their younger siblings. So that's been something that's definitely emerged during the COVID context. It really has further exposed many of the structural inequalities that we already knew existed. And also the pandemic has, I would argue, exacerbated systemic issues for children and young people, particularly those that are the most marginalised. And we know that the UN has highlighted that the pandemic has really turned into this broader child's rights crisis. So that's kind of the context that I'd like to start with. The themes from the research studies that I'd like to draw out today include children and young people's access, and also the implications of the existing digital divide. We know here in Australia that many children and young people live in rural and regional communities where internet access and connectivity is really disrupted or not accessible. We also know that many children and young people, as we heard in a previous webinar, experience living in poverty. And again, the costs of data are have implications really for them. I'd also like to mention about digital by default. So every aspect now, including education for children and play, has particularly during lockdowns, has been it has been removed from the physical sense of their lives into this virtual application. So I'd like to talk about that, and I'd also like to highlight that those children in the most vulnerable situations often do not get asked about their experiences. So I'd like to touch on that, and that's certainly a group that my research has involved and included in focus groups. And I'd like to talk about the positive aspects that children and young people have identified, and also the negative aspects, which often take the forms of online harms. So today, the framework of the UN CRC, the 3 Ps, provision, protection and participation, are the conceptual framework that I'd like to link to the themes of my research today. So first of all, provision. So that enables children's growth and their development. And we know that since the creation of the World Wide Web, we know that this has produced a lot of opportunities for us all to access information, to engage with people from all around the world. We know specifically through research that has been conducted during the pandemic that, for example, children with disabilities, that online platforms have provided them with opportunities for play and engagement. So we know that there are lots of positive benefits, and the children and young people that I have spoken to as part of focus groups during the pandemic have talked about finding that sense of belonging online, finding information online, engaging with their friends, for aspects of play, for aspects of schooling. And there were a number of children and young people from the LGBTQI community who talked about really finding a huge sense of belonging online that they just didn't feel that they had within their own communities. So there are lots of positives, but the provision of online spaces, given that those aspects that I mentioned before about rural and regional challenges, about poverty and data and cost implications, are real challenges for many families who are experiencing a variety of challenges in their lives. So access and digital inclusion is certainly a key issue and a theme that we really need to explore as well. The protection element, my research has really been focused a lot on what children and young people feel is acceptable use of online spaces, but also their experiences of online harms. And linking this to one of the P's, the conceptual framework that I mentioned of protection, what I've been finding is that there are a lot of grey areas. Really, when we ask ourselves about, what is harm, there are a huge number of grey areas that there just isn't any legislative framework or protection surrounding. And children and young people themselves have outlined that, aspects that make them feel uncomfortable on online spaces, and these often can be broken down into, unwanted content, unwanted contact, which is often from adults that they do not know, or other children and young people, or companies that contact them online. Also, they really felt that it was quite harmful, the delays that existed in relation to them seeking redress when they felt that something had occurred online and they'd made a complaint to a company. They felt actually the delay was harmful to them, and often came much after the event and made them relive the experience. The collection and use and sharing of imagery and other data is something that children and young people reported had been occurring much more during the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly lockdowns. And, speaking to those working in child protection and education, there were lots of reports from those professionals about, in between the lockdowns, that there were a surge of reports really when children had access to their trusted adults. And there were many, many examples in the focus groups of an increase in cyberbullying, sexual exploitation, and also harassment and threats, and a feeling of peer pressure, given that everything for children and young people had moved online. The one key issue that both children, young people and professionals mentioned was the sheer limited resources for aftercare support. So that there had been this huge increase of harm that children and young people were experiencing, yet there were such limited resources for aftercare. Those working in support services mentioned that in their experience, often children and young people that they engaged with, they needed support for long periods of time, and they often mentioned the average was over a year to a year and a half of counselling support. So we know that more resources and funding really does need to be put into aftercare. Children and young people really felt that in relation to online harms, they felt that companies should be much more held accountable for the lack of action and redress. And they also talked about the need and want for more personalised responses from companies. And I'll pick up on this again in relation to what a rights-based framework has to offer. So the key bit of research that I'd like to draw upon today is a piece of research that was conducted in partnership with Catch-22. Catch-22 had found that in a general survey that they had conducted, that more than 70% of young people had seen content online that they found concerning. And that, they were making reference to very specific and violent and explicit content, but only 40% of young people felt that they would report or could report online harms to the platforms that they were using. So really the research study was born out of that survey findings, and I really focused in on the experiences that children and young people were having online, and that also included on apps and gaming platforms, because often the gaming aspect had been left out from previous studies. Then there was this focus about, the impact that these experiences were having on children and young people's lives, what they deemed to be acceptable in online spaces, views on the police's role in addressing online harms, and also about regulatory frameworks and what arrangements should be developed. So in relation to ensuring, and we've had a webinar on participation, our last webinar, it was really key in this research to ensure that children and young people's experiences were recorded, were championed and valued. And this was something that was very central. We had a participatory framework for the research and a youth advisory group. As those working in the tech industry that I interviewed mentioned, they felt that actually exploring children and young people's experiences online were best done in the qualitative sense. So actually speaking directly to children and young people, because that's the way that we can better understand what the experiences and the challenges are, and actually glean and gain from children and young people how they feel that those should be addressed. So I worked with a youth advisory group in this research, and as you can see here on this slide, it involved quite a lot of field work and interviews, and also speaking to those working in the sector. Speaking to those working in the sector is vitally important, as I'll touch upon in a moment, given that we know that in order to see change, there really does need to be genuine partnership. And this is something which the UN committee through the general comment, a new general comment, has also really highlighted as well. You may like to check out, the interim findings. This was a participatory event which involved a number of people on the panel, and there was a young person who asked the panel members, had drafted some questions, so it may be of interest to some of you on this webinar. So children and young people, as I mentioned, there were lots of positive aspects to their engagement online. They found new hobbies, they enjoyed it for their education, needed it for education, and they felt that they had really a sense of belonging often on online spaces compared to in their community. Some young people also felt that it was easier to talk to people online than in person, and that they felt had assisted them with participating. So that was a really positive indication of their experience online. However, the majority of the time in the focus groups with children and young people was spent on them raising issues about their experiences online, and what they referred to as being quite toxic, the toxic nature of their interactions, and also the content that they were being exposed to. And they talked a lot about the impact of cyberbullying and threats and harassment and unwanted content and contact. And also they felt there were a lack of boundaries online, and the nature of restrictions for adults and young people, as well as the levels of surveillance, were some of the very negative aspects. They talked about the frameworks that already existed, like age verification that we hear so much about, and they talked about how they and their peer group basically navigate their way around age verification. They felt it was very ineffective. They also felt that the use of their data, they were really concerned about that. They wanted to have control and ownership of that, and many teenagers referred to implications for their future prospects of content that they had posted when they were younger, for example. So there are frameworks in Europe, such as the right to be forgotten, that many children and young people felt were a really great idea. They wanted to be able to avail of that. They wanted to be able to erase their content and not have it reposted or held against them. They were often quite future thinking in relation to transitioning into adulthood and work and employment. So in terms of what young children and young people said, there really was this sense of all children and young people have experienced negative things online. And many young people said, they didn't know anyone who hasn't had something bad go on online. They also talked about, this Wild West nature of, once something's out into that domain, it's very, very difficult to actually, stop that being shared amongst, large groups of people, and that had implications for them locally within their community, but also for some young people that had gone onto the international scene and had huge implications for them as well. They also talked about the very harmful content, and they talked about the sharing and reposting of quite distressing content that they had come across online, or the contact by what many young people referred to as predators. Now, children and young people had a lot of advice for other children and young people, but also for the adults in their lives. They talked a lot about trusted people in their lives, and they felt that, you know, any child or young person who's experiencing negative consequences online should try to speak to a trusted person. They also talked a lot about the balancing of their rights. So they really focused a lot on their right to privacy in these focus groups. And they talked about, you know, the need for parents and guardians and carers to actually act in a responsible way. They felt that adults weren't overly educated in relation to the capabilities of platforms. And this was something that really came through quite strongly in relation to gaming platforms, where children and young people, you know, were using these platforms, but their parents as well, or guardians or carers, didn't have you know, any experience of using those games and how to go about complaining if something had gone on the live game. They talked about the need for more education for adults, and they said that children and young people would be best to design that education framework. And they also talked about the need for the education that they receive to be much more tailored, much more interactive, and much more up to date. They said that they're often spoken to by adults who really don't engage with these platforms that often, or the information or education that they're given isn't up to date. It's not dealing with the latest platforms. And they talked a lot about responsibility and responses. They wanted swift responses from companies. They wanted companies to be given warnings, and they felt that those companies should be held accountable if they did something that was inappropriate or didn't respond in a swift manner. And they really talked a lot about children and young people's participation needs and wants. They wanted to participate. They wanted to be able to tell companies what was bad about the platforms and the products. And they wanted tech companies to have youth panels that would engage in meaningful ways with children and young people when they're designing platforms. But also they mentioned about the ongoing need to keep those platforms safe. And they felt that those conversations should go beyond the initial design process as well. Now, just very briefly, there has been a lot of discussions and talks in this space about regulation, and, you know, internationally at the moment, places like the United Kingdom are looking to places like Australia and other jurisdictions, and looking at, you know, is a regulatory framework what we need? And what I argue is that, you know, it's not a panacea. Regulation is one element of this, but we need a lot more education, but we also need to be engaging with the rights discourse. And unfortunately, in the international discussions, particularly at the moment in the United Kingdom about the regulation and the legislative framework that they're proposing, there's very little discussion of children's rights and that framework that actually does exist and that could be really beneficial for moving forward and ensuring that children and young people, you know, are provided with opportunities, that they have empowerment, that they are protected, but also that they are participating. So what kind of rights-based framework offer? So, you know, very exciting in this field that we've had the publication of the general comment number 25 on children's rights in relation to the digital environment. As I'm sure you've heard before, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you know, it obviously was, you know, released into the world at a time when we didn't have all of these platforms. And we know that with the digital environment, it's always evolving and changing. And the committee note this in the general comment. They say that you know, really that it is a different environment and a different world now, and there really was a need for the general comment to address and also propose, you know, a lot of what states, but also more generally also too, there's a lot of reference to companies and the bringing together in relation to we need full participation and accountability also in relation to these companies. So I'd like to draw out just as I kind of wrap up my talk and highlight a few aspects really from the general comment. So in paragraph 13, it mentions about state parties should involve the national local bodies that oversee the fulfillment of rights of children in such actions and consider the best interests of the child. And that includes their rights to seek and receive and impart information, to be protected from harm, and to have their views given due weight. And that's also to ensure transparency in the assessment of the child and the criteria that have been applied. So we know for quite some time, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has talked about children's right to information, and the internet does provide that platform. But children and young people, have talked about, for example, other jurisdictions where there are huge restrictions on what people can access on platforms. They've also talked about the need for advice on sexual health, for example, and information. And they've often talked about the restrictions that are placed on that information, yet platforms like the internet have the opportunity to provide them with information that they need and require. And they're very, very, the discussions with children and young people in the focus groups, I've talked a lot or learned a lot from them as well about the need for factual information and that to be fact checked as well. So they also, in the general comment, outline that the use of digital devices should not be harmful. They also shouldn't be a substitute for in-person interactions among children or between children, parents, and caregivers. We know that there has been, particularly in the media, a lot of discussions about this construction of, children and young people shouldn't be spending all of their time online. It's unhealthy. So it's interesting that the general comment talks a lot about the need to ensure that we do cherish the in-person interactions as well. They also note that training and advice on appropriate use of digital devices should be given to parents and caregivers, educators, and relevant actors. And that should take into the account really all of the evolving research that's being conducted on the effects of digital technologies on children's development. So again, very much in line with what children and young people want to see, much more tailored, interactive training for parents and guardians and educators. And children and young people that I've spoken to really feel that they want to be at the heart of designing and developing all of that. And paragraph 32 of the general comment mentions that such programs should include information on how children can benefit from digital products and services and develop their digital literacy and skills, also how to protect their privacy and prevent victimization, and also the need to recognize children who are being victimized by harm that's perpetrated online. And they also highlight in the general comment that these programs should be informed by research and consultations with children, parents, and caregivers. And the final point drawing out from the general comment is that companies are talked about in the general comment. So both their role in relation to partnership work, but also the fact that a lot of the content is commercially driven. So these companies are making a profit from this. So the general comment really does make a lot of reference to commercial companies as well. So I'd like to draw your attention to that. Now, just the last point really on participation. Children and young people were very clear that they're not asked often enough about their experiences online, and they wanted to be asked about their experiences online. They felt they had a lot to say, but they also had a lot of suggestions about what could make those spaces safer for them, much more accessible. Going back to the UNICEF report, UNICEF really recommended that the Australian government should prioritise digital access and online safety, particularly in relation to vulnerable groups of children through targeted programmes. And as I've highlighted through the qualitative research that I've done, children and young people really want to be part of designing and developing, but also implementing those programmes. And UNICEF also recommended that, research should be ongoing. We know that there is this evolving nature of digital platforms and children's experiences, and there really is a need for research to be continuously ongoing. And as I've argued, this involves really companies being much more transparent and opening up to researchers really in relation to what their capabilities are and how those capabilities could be used to design platforms and ensure that platforms are maintained in a safe manner. And this can be done through partnerships. So, governments and regulators and digital companies and advocates and children and young people working together. The safety by design model that the Safety Commissioner in Australia advocates for is an excellent model to look to, and one that we can really see that the principles of the convention, but also what's highlighted in the general comment can be put together in relation to moving forward. And lastly, something that I actually got sent by a PhD student today who said this looks like it would be of interest. We can see here that a lot of, based on and drawing on that point about participation, and also from our previous seminar by Professor Lundy, there are discussions now at the moment in Australia about the need to actually have representation for children and young people, and these new proposals that have been posted today about the need to have frameworks that directly and formally engage children and young people in Australia, the need for an office for youth and a minister for youth could also be excellent frameworks to ensure that children and young people's rights and participation really in moving forward are at the heart of all spaces and aspects of their lives. So I've got some slides here that Claire can share around with resources. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm possibly over my time. So.
Thank you very much, Faith, for this fantastic presentation and for putting children's voices front and center. Although voices are often missed from the discussion among adults about what should be done for children. And it's great to hear so much about what they feel that should be done for them and with them. While we wait for our participants to plug in some questions at the chat box, let me kick off the Q&A session with asking you what can be done, what should be done. I mean, some of our participants here works at civil society, some works at government, and the general comment stipulates a number of action points and things that can be done in order to protect our children in the online space and to facilitate their participation. So it would be very helpful if you can tell us a bit more about the sort of duties the convention and the general comments allocates to civil society, to government, and to the business sector.
I think that these are discussions that we need to be having now. So we've got the framework of the general comment. We've got various models that that do exist, like safety by design, that really does bring together people that are designing these platforms, the law enforcement, the regulatory framework, and vulnerable social groups that are using and most affected when things are harmful online. I think now that we have the general comment, these discussions really need to take place about, practically speaking, what does this mean on the ground? I think what's really challenging, and I guess this is something that comes up quite a lot in all of the webinars here in Australia, is that we don't have the domestic human rights framework here. So in terms of holding the Australian government to account for inaction, it's really challenging when we don't have that. And I thought today, that announcement about an office for youth, for example, that'll be a really positive step forward, and even more so positive if we had a rights-based approach and framework surrounding that. So in relation to what could be done or should be done, the framework that already exists with the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner, we know that the removal of content through that office when reporting works, and we know that there's a lot of ongoing research that office funds as well, and that's really, really important work. My research is really with children and young people in the criminal justice system, and particularly those that have also experienced the care system. And those children and young people often feel that they're not really included in a lot of discussions, and their issues are quite specific to them. So I think that there needs to be a broadening out of discussions, and an emphasis as well on like multiple layers of vulnerability as well. And it is important that, and in work that I've done with Laura Lundy and others, that really that the participation rights, ensuring that they're not eclipsed by the protection, because that would be extremely negative for children and young people if that was the case.
Thank you. One of the main actors that haven't been mentioned so far today in a meaningful way are parents. And if parents are, this is how the convention conceptualizes them, are the key players in protecting children's rights and facilitating their rights, and also have a duty to protect their children. What would you expect parents to do? What does the convention expect parents to do in this context and balancing protection and participation?
Yeah, the children and young people that I spoke to in my research talked a lot about parents and guardians and carers. They really felt that they weren't overly educated about online spaces. And they also talked about, which I find really interesting, was the older siblings assisting younger siblings, so monitoring younger siblings online, but also helping them often to make complaints. So there were lots of young people that spoke a lot about that. They talked about, their parents, the sharing of devices. So there were a number of very young children who safeguarding officers, mentioned in interviews, had access to a parent's device and had saw content that wasn't age appropriate. So the sharing of devices can often lead to unwanted consequences. And a number of the victim support counsellors and officers that I interviewed talked a lot about the need, often the guilt that parents felt when that was the case, that a child had come across something because they'd handed them their phone and there wasn't any protection mechanism on it. And that they have also had to do a lot of work with parents in relation to that, which again, there's a very limited resource bank for. So that was something that definitely has come up in research that I've conducted, but hugely the need for, as children and young people have identified, their parents to have much more education. The teachers that I spoke to, there were many teachers who, they monitored what children and young people were talking about, and then they went and actually accessed games and played them so that they had a knowledge base about them so that they could interact with children. But often Online Safety Week, as children and young people reported, is a week. It's highlighted for a week, and then it kind of disappears off the radar. So they wanted it much more embedded in a yearly process in schools that involved also their parents and guardians.
Thank you. So that ties into the point that James McDowell made on the chat. Whether you think that children has a role to play here in educating their parents of how to engage with this online world. And then as a subsequent action, parents will know better what to do and what to expect to find their partly parents' ability to exercise their duty of care also depends on their knowledge of what's going on in this online world, and the opportunities and danger that this space present to children.
That was definitely something which came up. And there was, in some of the workshops with children and young people, there was a bit of a divide and a split in opinions. So some children and young people felt that parents should be stricter and monitor, and guardians should monitor more. And then other children and young people really wanted to have their privacy protected, but go to a trusted adult if they felt they wanted to speak to one. Another aspect that really came through as well was the commercialization. So particularly in online gaming, where certain games that had an age rating of 15, there were commercial items and clothing that were being pitched at much younger children. So there wasn't a lot of discussion about that in focus groups and the commercialization and nature of that. And often people felt that was quite exploitative as well. So I'm doing some work on that with a colleague from LSE. So I think that's a key point as well. And I think it's something that really the general comment has highlighted too, about the commercially driven nature and about also the use. Children and young people were really concerned about the use of their data. And third-party usage as well.
Thank you. That also ties into some other questions that popped up in the chat. We're approaching the end of this webinar, so let's use the Frankie Maxwell question as an opportunity to zoom out and to ask if you feel that there are any issues or themes that the general comment has failed to address or didn't address adequately.
Oh, wow, that's a really great question. And I think that there was a lot of work and in terms of the drafting of it and the nature of what's included. I think in this space that things are always evolving. So I think it's the need for this to kind of always be, it is always an evolving space, and it's really challenging to keep up with the with technology. And a key thing that I guess my research really has highlighted as well is the lack of transparency in relation to companies. And I'm not sure that the general comment, I'm not sure really that it, it's captured that kind of challenge. And it is a real challenge. And, we know that there, that I find in my research that companies weren't very transparent in engaging. And that is a huge challenge for us to be able to gain any insight into the capabilities of the technology. And also what's being done with data, for example, as well. So it is hugely challenging. And, I really would call on companies to be more transparent, really, and engage much more and be open to independent research being conducted. I think that the full emphasis on, regulation will sort this out and will be the answer. I really don't feel that it is enough. And I think that what's currently going on in the UK with this discussion about the proposed legislative framework, the online safety bill, is that, there is a lack of discussion about rights and the rights framework. And I think that's really remiss, because, we know that it has a lot to bring and really should underpin the formation of, any new legislative framework. So I think that that's something that is really lacking in the discussions. I don't think rights features enough. And I think people place a lot of emphasis on regulation. But we know that, harmful things like grooming, exploitation, we know that these have existed for so long in communities and society, for example. Now they take new forms online, but I really feel that regulation, it isn't enough. We need underpinning, education changes in society as well. But we definitely need rights to be at the heart of the discussions.
Thank you. One last question, and paraphrasing some of the questions that came up on the chat. If we are looking at generational gap, lack of proper adult supervision or inability to properly supervise their children. Children have direct access to information because they can have access to internet through different range of devices at home or at school or at friend's place. From a child right perspective, do you think that at some point parents should just ban children from going online at certain times of the day or at locations where they cannot be properly guided or supervised?
I think it's a bit dangerous to fully look at this as a parent and guardian discussion and debate, because it's much wider and broader than that. You know, if these things weren't occurring online, there would be no need to, you know, have this discussion about extra monitoring. And what was interesting about the focus groups that I held recently was that, you know, we talked about what's acceptable online, what's acceptable use, and children and young people came up with all sorts of descriptions about what they felt was acceptable use of online spaces. And I think that, you know, if people are using these spaces in an acceptable and, you know, respectful manner, then children and young people would be free to participate and not be worried about these harmful incidences that they often come up against. So I think purely having a discussion about, you know, parents need to ban or monitor is really, would really breach children and young people's participation rights. And I think that those shouldn't be eclipsed by, you know, this full focus on protection. I think there's also a dangerousness within this kind of phraseology about resilience as well. And I find that those from tech companies and regulators that I spoke to talked a lot about resilience. But when asked about the meaning of it, they said, well, if children and young people experience these things, harmful things online, they build a resilience against them. But I really think we should be unpacking these terms and what we mean by them as well. And I think placing, you know, saying that children and young people should be more resilient puts a lot of emphasis on the individual and removes it from the systems that are in place that they're engaging with.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for this excellent Q&A session. And thank you everyone for posting your questions on the chat. I'll let Matthew wrap up the webinar.
Thank you, Nom, and thank you everyone for attending, particularly during the current time of troubles right around the world. We really value your attending. We really value that you come from all corners of the globe, and we hope that you and your families and loved ones remain safe. I would like to thank today Dr. Faith Gordon. Faith, as I mentioned earlier, is a great friend of the program that is run by the Diplomacy Training Program in partnership with Youth Law Australia and Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and along with NOM provides expert guidance to that program, and we've all enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you, Faith. I'd also very much like to thank the people behind the webinar, in particular Patrick Earle, Claire Sidoti and Andre Frankovitz of the Diplomacy Training Program. Thank you very much, Patrick, Claire and Andre, for your support of this wonderful series that is now reaching to all corners of the globe. We do have registrants from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas, and from the Indo-Pacific region. So thank you all for coming. We wish you all the best. We'll keep you advised of the next in the webinar series. And for those of you in Australia, we're hoping soon to return as well to our face-to-face events, which are generally over 2 days in a capital city. So stay well, please, everyone. And until we see you next time, thank you very much and goodbye.